Let's talk about power sanding real quick. Power sanding is an often overlooked discipline and it's rarely taught, and that's unfortunate because there's a lot of dynamics that are going into power sanding when we sand our bowls. Now we're going to focus in on these little hook and loop discs. Now I use the largest disc possible for the product I'm sanding because think about this, if I use a 2-inch disc on maybe a 12-inch bowl, it doesn't last that long. A 3-inch disc has twice as much surface area than a 2-inch disc, and therefore it's going to last longer. And also, you get what you pay for when it comes to sanding discs. So if it's a cheap disc, it's probably not going to last very long. Now, this is a typical sanding sequence I would go through when I'm sanding my work. 80, 120, 180, 220, and so forth. What's going on here is there's not more than a 50% jump in number, and if there is, it's going to be much more difficult to remove those heavier scratches with a finer grit down below. Also, if I use a brand new 80 grit here and I use a worn 120 grit to try to get those 80 grit scratches out, it's going to be much more difficult to do. So let's go ahead and look at how we sand these bowls. Okay, I've chosen this maple piece because it's nice and light and it'll show torn grain really well. One thing to note here is when we're on our coarser grits, the drill is moving so fast and the lathe is spinning at about 500 RPMs. I don't want to hit the dead center with those coarse grits because I'll create a divot and ruin my nice tool work. I won't touch the dead center for any length of time until I get to the finer grits, 220, 320. Now let's go ahead and sand. Let's look at some torn grain up close. Okay, you can see some really bad torn bits right in this area here. And that was caused by the ripple in the figure of the wood. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my power sander over those areas before I rotate the bowl to sand. But I'll constantly move the sander so I don't create any flat spots on these surfaces here. So let's get rid of that torn grain. Now I'm trying to use the whole face of the disc here. The whole surface is on the wood there, not on the angle. I see a lot of people use it on the angle, and that's not what you want to do. You want to use the whole surface of the disc. Now once we have all this torn grain out and all our tool marks, we can rotate the lathe. Okay, I've sanded all the way through with my 80 grit now. Now I'm checking for any torn grain or tool marks that may have been left behind. It looks pretty good, so now I can proceed. Well, let's take a look at what the sander's doing. In this case, I'm going to spin the lathe in the forward motion, and my drill is going to be counteracting that motion. So I'm going to use the right side of the disc only, about 50% of the disc to the right hand side, and I'll work from the center to the outer rim, center to the outer rim, and I'm constantly counteracting the spin of the lathe. Now one way to know if you're going in the wrong direction is if your drill over accelerates. That means you're not going in the right direction, okay? Now the same thing goes, let's put it in reverse. Now I'm going to counteract the spin going in the other direction, using the middle to the left-hand side this time, up to the rim. Again. One thing else, I'm always going to clean out my bowl as I sand, because what destroys sandpaper is heat and itself. And as it breaks down, it's in the wood fiber, so I want to clean the bowl out as I go. Otherwise, it'll break down the next grit much faster. That looks pretty good. Now, I want to give you an argument for having a lathe that reverses. You'll do a much better job power sanding if you can get a lathe that reverses. So basically, if I'm going 80 grit in one direction, I go 120 in another direction, 180 in the other direction, 220, and you'll get a much nicer sanding job. Okay, let's take a look at the back side of the bowl now. In the forward position here, I'm going to sand with the left-hand side of the disc here. Again, counteracting, going the opposite direction of the lathe. Using as much of the flat part of the disc as possible. And since I have a detail here, I'm going to sand in the other direction. Now, again, using the right-hand side of the disc this time, counteracting the spin of the bowl.